Hello and welcome back to my channel The Bleach Fanfiction. Join us as we explore the world of fanfiction and fantasy and bring you the best story and discussions. This is the final part of What If Ichigo Traveled Back in Time. So give this video a like and subscribe for more videos in future. So let's get into the fanfic. A crackle overhead. A burst of light. Suzuki kept his posture prim and proper as decorum would dictate, even though nobody was paying him any attention. The heir of the Shihoin must always present an impeccable demeanor was a motto that Yoruchi had literally beaten into him, to the extent that his arm twinged in phantom pain every time he so much as thought about slouching. He chanced a glance at Yoruchi beside him, seated placidly in Saiza, not a trace of emotions on her features. No sign that she was irritated by the fact that she had been spending a few hours in the biting cold, or boiling inside too many layers of kimono. He was reluctantly impressed that he couldn't even tell which, in a crowd of stiff-necked nobles. Then again, this was the same woman who had punched Yami with a broken arm without flinching, and then knowingly broke her diamond leg to kick his head in because she couldn't risk the downtime needed to disengage and activate Shunko. Another burst of fireworks painted the night red and green. He fought the urge to shift, yet again. Saiza wasn't normally a problem for him, even back when he had been human he could do it for at least an hour. His old room at home didn't have enough chairs, so it was usual for his friends to use the Saiza mats when visiting. And of course Kisuke's Shoten didn't have chairs, except in his private laboratory where it had been a necessity. However, 6 hours was pushing it for him, even after 5 years of training. Suzuki raised his eyes to the sakura trees swaying gently in the breeze, boughs heavily laden with pink flowers. Yazakura, the night viewing of the first bloom of cherry blossoms, was a tradition passed down since ancient times. The 5 great noble houses, too, had adopted this tradition. This year's Yazakura was especially packed, everyone had come to see the newborn Hashigi princess. As always, the birth of a child was an event of tremendous importance, given the sheer rarity of a couple generating enough Ryatsu to spark the creation of a new soul, not to mention the uphill battle of actually carrying to term. Even Yoruchi, with her enormous reserves and pain tolerance, would have been strong-pressed to manage it without outside support. However, the presence of such a gathering also meant that the usually informal hanami had turned into a formal reception that wouldn't have looked out of place in the emperor's court. Save for the clan head's immediate family and the council of elders, if the clan had any, every other attending individual had been drafted for security duty. Suzuki bit back a sigh and wished, not for the first time, that he had been allowed to join the retinue too. He had spotted Tessai discussing Kido execution with a few Nakatomi earlier, and Isshin had been his usual idiotic self over by the Shiba fireworks cannon, while he had been stuck pandering to some Kuchiki elders bent on trying to measure his potential against their own heirs. Personally, Suzuki had nothing against Kuchiki Sojin, who was a soft-spoken, mild-mannered man. The current lieutenant of the 6th Division couldn't have been more different than the one he was familiar with in the future. Kuchiki Jinrei, too, was a dignified older man in whose bearing he could see shadows of the man Byakuya would one day be, but Jinrei radiated a warmth that his grandson lacked. But as was the case with the Shihoin, the Council of Elders seemed to be on a completely different level altogether. Perhaps the other 3 great noble clans had the right of it when they chose to abolish their councils. The Shiba had cited the fact that the clan was spread throughout Rukongai as the reason for this, while the Nakatomi elders voluntarily disbanded their council upon them being elected to Council 46 several centuries ago, and the Hashigi was far too small to need a council. In fact, before the fortuitous birth of Hashigi Yukiko to the clan head, there was fear that the Hashigi would die out within the next generation. She was a rare child indeed. Abruptly, Yoruchi's Ryatsu twitched, like the tail of an agitated cat, just a fraction. If he hadn't been next to her, and so used to reading minute changes in her Ryatsu, he would never have noticed it. Suzuki stiffened, senses coming on high alert, watching her out of the corner of his eye. Then he heard it too, in the lull of the fireworks exploding overhead, the faintest splash of water. Wait. Suzuki slowed his breathing, easing his Ryatsu until it bubbled just beneath the surface of his skin, without letting it escape. Outwardly, he remained politely interested in the fireworks overhead, but his peripheral vision was trained on the river. Then red smoke exploded out of the ground a scant few meters from where they were seated, swiftly engulfing the area and rendering vision useless. Heido number 54, 10 ran. Yoruchi's voice tore through the growing screams like the blast of wind that ripped through the thickening cloud of smoke, clearing the skies in an instant. Beside him, Sojin drew from a Seiza position in a classic Ichigo move Suzuki had only ever heard about, his Zanpakuto leaping from the scabbard into his hand in a quick draw so smooth that it had gone through the first attacker before his eyes had even registered the movement. But the sword hesitated in its motions, its wielder freezing. A single drop of blood fell to the ground. Lower your weapons. Slowly, very hesitantly, Sojin lowered his Zanpakuto. All around, silence fell as the other armed guards halted their advance, eyes fixed on the scene before them. Byakuya snarled wordlessly and kicked futilely at his captor, until the knife slid warningly across his throat, drawing a thin line of red visible in the starlit night. Kuchiki Akane growled low in her throat. At a sharp glance from her father-in-law, she quieted, but her hand was white over the hilt of her own Zanpakuto. What is your goal? Kuchiki Jinrei asked calmly but authoritatively, as though his grandson's life was not on the line. You wouldn't understand even if we told you, the man holding Byakuya aloft growled. Yoruchi's Ryatsu spasmed oddly at that line. A gust of wind rustled through the sakura trees, sending a swirl of pink petals fluttering like the blades of senbon-sakura. Suzuki's mind went crystal clear. Didn't Byakuya's parents die during a cherry blossom viewing? In exchange for your heir. In almost slow motion, he could see how it would all pan out. Sojin had always been more of a classical samurai. Without his Zanpakuto he would be no match for the group he could see loosely surrounding them in the shadows. If any of them had a long-ranged shuriken attack or was even moderately proficient at Kido, Byakuya wouldn't be safe either. There was only one choice, really. Would a different heir suffice? He asked loudly. Sojin's face went blank with shock. Yoruchi's eyes darted to him, lightning quick, but she made no move to stop him. Sharp eyes scrutinized him closely. Shihoin Suzuki. There was a hint of, was that smugness? In the man's voice. Very well. Remove your weapons and walk over slowly. Suzuki slowly got to his feet, wobbling as the pins and needles in his numb legs made themselves known, and removed the tanto strap to his right leg. Clearly telegraphing each move, he raised both hands to let billowing sleeves fall to his shoulders, revealing a band of bow shuriken around his left forearm. Unbuckling it slowly, he let it fall to the mat with a soft clink, and then slid the manriki chain out from where it had been hidden in the elaborate knot of his obi sash. Stop. About 30 paces away, Suzuki halted as demanded. His eyes flitted over the two men who had stepped up behind the one holding Byakuya captive, before refocusing on their spokesperson. From the corner of his eye, he saw one of the two raise his hand and mutter something too soft to catch. The effects were obvious, however, as his arms snapped painfully behind his back and thick manacles wound around his wrists, binding them in place amidst sharp gasps of horror behind him. Continue forwards. Leaning forward slightly to maintain his balance, Suzuki stumbled a few steps forwards, until he could see the quiver in Byakuya's lip, the way man carelessly let him dangle from one hand, trusting the knife held to the boy's throat to ensure his obedience. The way none of the three were paying the boy the slightest attention, eyes fixed on Suzuki. His foot caught on a loose stone and he lurched, going down on one knee. There was a scattering of muffled sniggers. Through the curtain of hair half fallen over his face at this sudden movement Suzuki snapped his gaze up, focused, and wrenched. The man howled as razor-thin wires bit bloody gouges into his arm, forcing the knife away from Byakuya. The other end of the wire wound over the digits of his other hand, such that he had to choose between dropping Byakuya and losing his fingers. His grip loosened reflexively, and the boy fell. A shadow dropped out of the nearest tree, caught Byakuya before the boy had even touched the ground, and blurred out of sight before anyone else could react. At the same time, Suzuki rotated his left wrist and dislocated it with a loud crack that sounded disproportionately loud in the silence, slipping his limp left hand out of the manacles. Even as he rose, his wrist was already glowing faintly green, bones realigning themselves and sprained tendons knitting themselves back together. As he kept his eyes fixed on the enemy, a hand brushed lightly over his right wrist, and the remnants of the manacles shattered, the pieces dissolving before they hit the ground. The entire process had taken less than 5 seconds. Kisuke deposited the brat next to Akane, who immediately moved, half-shielding her son with her body. Yoruchi let her gaze settle back on Suzuki, who hadn't moved beyond getting to his feet, his shuriken keeping the trio of men restrained. She had strong suspicions as to whether he had really tripped, or whether it had just been a diversion. Any sudden movement could have triggered Byakuya's captor to press down on the knife reflexively, but it was when covered by a supposed bout of clumsiness. In no way did that word describe the young man who learned to move from the finest assassin in the history of the Onmitsukido, who glided over the Shihoin's most sensitive nightingale floors with nary a chirp, while evading erratic sprays of shrapnel with an innate grace gymnasts would weep for. Yoruchi felt her lips twitch. Idiots who continued to look down upon Suzuki for his relative youth or his supposed Rukongai roots would only play into the palm of his hand. And of course, none of them had thought to do a headcount. Such arrogance. She had felt the faint crimson mist that was Kisuke's Ryatsu wink completely out of existence the moment Suzuki had tensed. Really, though, the youth had no sense of subtlety. She was sure at least Jinrei and possibly Sojin had been alerted when Suzuki's Ryatsu drew back under his skin, as if a lake had just vanished. Still, to release his Zanpakuto within the scant second the smokescreen had lingered before her Tenran had dispersed it, Yoruchi fought down a grin. His learning curve was just as exponential as ever. She reached down, picked up the discarded band of bow shuriken lying on the mat, and handed it to Kisuke, who had stepped up soundlessly next to her. Kisuke rolled it up tightly, secured it, and then drew back his arm and flung. Suzuki's arm came up, lightning quick, and snatched it out of midair as it passed. With deft motions he strapped it back to his forearm, letting his sleeve fall back to show that it was loaded and ready. As though it had been a signal of some sort, both sides shook themselves out of their stupor. The armed guards charged forwards, meeting the shadowed attackers in a metallic clang of weapons. Yoruchi rose to her feet with feline grace, surveying the battlefield. "Get the civilians together." The cry rose up around her, and hearing it, Suzuki took a few steps backwards. She could see most of his attention focused on Byakuya's failed kidnappers, using only his sense of situational awareness to avoid the clashes going on all around him. A step, another, until he was out of immediate lunging range, and then he turned sideways so that he could see what was happening behind him. Almost immediately he was swallowed into the crowd, emerging a few moments later with a little girl tucked under his arm. Giving her a little push towards the defensive circle forming around the bulk of the civilians, he turned his attention back to the other fights. The girl ran, tripped, and only with a lightning-fast shunpa did Yoruchi catch her in time. Pushing the girl behind her, a flick of her wrist scattered the tetsubishi hidden in the pouch of her haori over the ground, and the few hapless attackers who had not stopped their charge in time screamed as the sharp iron spikes shredded the thin soles of their waraji sandals, embedding into flesh. "Watch out!" Shiba Kaien, who had yelled the warning, leapt forwards and tackled Hashiji Kasumi out of the way in time, an arrow whizzing barely an inch from their heads. She curled into her infant daughter protectively as they landed, Kaien having braced himself on his arms to avoid landing on either of them. Crackling yellow light flew past them, skewering the archer to a tree in the shape of a triangle before he could line up another shot, his bow dropping from nerveless fingers. "Good job, Sui Feng." With a terse nod, the girl rushed past Yoruchi to land the finishing blow, just as another civilian staggered into their loose circle. Bakudo number 9, Horin. Kuchiki Akane stood, sleeves billowing, orange fire wound with yellow spirals streaming from her fingers. They snaked around the battles, here and there, entangling clumps of attackers and dragging them into the path of a well-timed sokatsui by her father-in-law. Whirling around, Yoruchi brought her arms up just in time to deflect a barrage of shuriken, which sliced easily through her white gloves to impact against the metal-armed guards beneath. She winced at the thought of the scolding she was going to get for letting them get damaged, but at least it was just the gloves and not her kimono. The elders would have her head if she tried to shunko in a kimono that cost half the Shihoin estate. Despite superior skill, they were being pushed back, restrained by the need to defend individual civilians and the prospect of friendly fire. The guards' poor starting positions stayed their hands from their more destructive attacks, whereas the attackers had no such qualms. "We need some time," hissed clan head Nakatomi Kazuhiko, even as he wordlessly threw up a danku barrier that repelled a wave of purple fire. His wife Junko was kneeling on the mat, archaic symbols racing over the ground under her steady hand, blooming into the beginning sequence of a barrier Kido. A gust of wind blew past, and then the hair that she had spent an hour pinning up was fluttering gently around her shoulders. She whipped around, and saw the thin nunchakus serving as her hair sticks buried into the neck of an assassin that had just burrowed out of the ground. What really caught her attention, however, were the clawed gauntlets glinting dangerously, wetly in the dim moonlight. "They're using poison." Kisuke spun back around, taking in the details in one glance, and then he was racing across her minefield of tetsubishi, weaving through the remnants of sharp spikes without a stray glance downwards. A flash of purple hair caught her eye, and then she lost sight of them both in the crowd. Wires materialized seemingly out of thin air around the bulk of the civilians, coalescing into razor-thin threads that had the attackers pulling up short, eyeing the dome warily. At a slight gesture the entire construct began spinning rapidly, wind whistling a high pitch through the slanted cracks. Tessai's Ryatsu flared out a moment before a clatter of waraji sounded next to her. Breathing out a sigh, Yoruchi shook a stray strand of hair out of her face, slipping the kaiken dagger that had slid instinctively into her palm back into her sleeve. "Suzuki Dano's barrier is only temporary." She inclined her head briefly, eyes scanning the battlefield. "What would you recommend?" Tessai hesitated. "For danku barriers, perhaps," he finally offered. "Until the Nakatomi finish their Kido." Without wasting time to acknowledge his plan, Yoruchi whipped her head around, searching for a suitable Kido expert in the vicinity, Akane-san. The other woman's head came up, and Yoruchi blurred over in a burst of shunpa, her formal kimono swishing across the grass. "Are you good at danku?" A blink, and then a calm nod. "We need a fourth," Yoruchi murmured, swiveling her head to and fro. "One of the Shiba," Akane suggested. With the Nakatomi otherwise occupied, a member of the other Kido-based clan would be the best choice. Although the Shiba were usually more focused on the offensive Heido, danku was a staple in the arsenal of any Kido expert for its fast casting speed and utility. A few meters away, Kayen's head turned in their direction, obviously having heard his clan name. "Danku," called Yoruchi succinctly. The other clan head's eyes widened briefly in understanding, then he sidestepped an attacker, cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted, "Ishin-ji." A few moments passed as the nearest Shiba members spread the call for Ishin, and then the man himself struggled out of the mess of skirmishes. Kayen pointed him to them, who were shuffling into position in 3 of the 4 cardinal points, the last slot left for him. "Count of 3, then." 1, 2, 3. As 1, 4 voices shouted, "Bakudo number 81, danku." Risking another glance backwards, Suzuki heaved a sigh of relief, letting his dome of wires collapse now that there was no need for it. With a quick glance upwards, he guided the 2 coils of wire up and out through the opening at the top, and then looked back just in time to dodge an arrow aimed between his eyes, so close that it nearly shaved off part of his eyebrows. Normally he would have grabbed it instead of dodging, but if it was poisoned as Kisuke had warned, then that would be a very stupid move. Ducking another stray Kido, he scanned the vicinity for civilian stragglers, but found none. Alive, that was. His fists clenched as his gaze swept over a man face down on the ground, a growing dark patch oozing onto the grass underneath his corpse. Shiba Ganju is missing. A dull boom sounded in the distance where he knew the Shiba cannon to be, and he stepped into a Shuanpa to avoid a roaring conflagration skimming over the grass, tearing through the attackers. Making his way to the shimmering barrier, he arrived just in time to catch the end of Byakuya's explanation. Told him to hide in the reeds near the river. The boy's voice was high but clear, with just the slightest quaver of anxiety. Kyan cursed, eyes on the melee between them and the riverbank, where the fiercest skirmishes raged. Suzuki, repeated Yoruchi from her position inside the barrier, can you open a path? The way Kyan's eyes snapped to him made him pause, glancing down at their attire. No wonder she had called him over. The other clan head wouldn't be able to make it through on his own, even though the men's formal kimonos were relatively looser than the women's, more than half his usual maneuverability would be gone. Suzuki had been making do with a lot of Shuanpa and near misses, and he couldn't imagine how Yoruchi had managed in hers. At least the security detail had been allowed to wear less formal clothing, or they would have lost long ago. Well, that thing he had been practicing could be used in this situation, he supposed. Instead of answering her verbally, he centered himself with a deep breath, releasing the hold on his Ryatsu. His Shirkai leapt to his command at a gesture, one wire weaving itself into the shape of a raft, the other reforming into the dome-shaped structure he was more familiar with. Stepping onto the raft hovering just barely off the ground, he waved at Kyan. Get on. The clan head moved to obey, eyes wide in his face. The wire dome lowered itself around them and began its customary rotation, blocking any stray attacks. Crouching down and keeping a firm hold on the raft, Suzuki stretched his Ryatsu senses to the maximum, and silently commanded the entire construct to move. Behind him, he heard Kyan stumble slightly as the raft lurched into action, but most of his concentration was fixed on keeping the entire construct off the ground and finding the shortest route possible through the thick of the battle without accidentally slicing any allies apart. It would take a lot more practice, he absent-mindedly noted, before it would be a viable method to transport patients in a live combat zone. At least he didn't have to worry about Kyan accidentally falling off. He focused on the Ryatsu signatures winking in and out all around them, and inwardly heaved a sigh of relief when they began moving away, clearing a space for him to pass through. Nobody sane wanted to challenge a giant metallic structure surrounded by wickedly sharp blades, after all. Clearing the last of the skirmishes, he let the raft land with a heavy rattle that made him wince, definitely need to work more on that, and unwound half the wire dome to let Kyan out. With a nod of gratitude, the other man slipped into the darkness, calling Ganju's name softly. Suzuki turned his own attention to the raft, enlarging it to fit 3 people and expanding the dome as necessary. It was probably a good thing Ganju was still a child, there was no way this raft was going to fit 3 fully grown adults, something else to iron out later. Good thing, too, that neither he nor Kyan were exceptionally tall. He briefly envisioned trying to fit Zaraki Kenpachi into the dome, and had to stifle an inappropriate snicker at the thought of accidentally slicing one of his spikes off. A rustle of grass caught his ear, then, and instantly all mirth disappeared from his mind. Suzuki frowned, letting one of his throwing darts fall into his hand, turning to the open doorway. Kayandano? He asked, just to confirm, though he was already sure Ganju couldn't possibly be that quiet. No one trying to sneak up on him would be an ally. Only the glint of metal in the dim moonlight saved him, as a blade moved into the spaces between the wires making up the dome, and he threw himself sideways in time. Crashing into the razor-thin wires. On the opposite side and feeling them bite into places where his metal arm guards didn't reach, Suzuki used the momentum to bounce himself back to his feet, just as another blade slammed into where he had been. More than one person, then. Keeping the construct ready for a quick getaway was pointless if he couldn't defend himself, and with that in mind, he let the dome collapse fully, freeing one of his wires. A glance around showed him 8 attackers surrounding him in a semicircle, spaced far apart enough in a staggered formation that none of them would be caught by friendly fire nor in the backlash of his attacks. His eyes narrowed even as his hand brushed across the available wire, sending a current of electricity down it with barely a thought. His instincts screamed as he jerked backwards, dropping to a crouch as an arrow whizzed past his ear. Something was wrong, he could almost feel it, but there was no time to ponder that train of thought further when the 8 he could see began launching long-ranged attacks in no apparent order. Someone had drilled that tactic into them, even half the Onmitsukido weren't so disciplined under pressure. A magnet would be really useful right about now, he reflected as he dodged a blast of red fire, and nearly missed the projectiles that were hidden in its shadow. Well, 2 could play at that game. The next time a stream of Kido came at him, Suzuki loosened a barrage of bow shuriken from both hands, adding a touch of Ryatsu to increase their speed even as he formed a wire shield in front of him to deflect the score of shuriken flung his way. 2 down, at least 6 more to go. With where the arrows were coming from, though, if he had sufficient time, he could follow them back along their trajectory to find the original archer. A dull boom sounded, followed by the unmistakable blaze of yellow. Someone, probably a Shiba, knowing their predilection for this particular Kido, had gotten impatient and unleashed a Raikoho. With the civilians safely out of the way, more and more destructive attacks were being brought out. His fingers closed on the last throwing dart in his holster. A faint frown creased his brow and he gave an almost unnoticeable sigh. As though sensing weakness, the remaining 6 closed in. Suzuki didn't need to see the widening smirks on their faces to know what they were thinking. He was alone, immobile, almost unarmed, both his shuriken wires were clearly visible, with one of them lying on the grass and the other wreathed in lightning. There was never going to be a better time. They were right, too, except for one thing. Suzuki let the last bow shuriken fly from his hand, watched it get dodged almost mockingly by one of the advancing attackers, and let his hands drop to his sides. Whatever gave them the idea that he was unarmed? The unassuming sandalwood fan slid out of his obi sash. Covered in white silk, it looked like one of those flimsy things nearly every noble in attendance was carrying as decoration. Snapping it open, one could see a swooping hawk in mid-flight and a short poem embroidered on the outside, elegant and ornamental, and totally useless in a fight. None of them even paused in their strides. Suzuki flipped it around with a twist of his wrist and swept it across in a wide, horizontal slide. So close and caught completely off guard, they had no chance of dodging the beam of yellow energy that hit them before they could react. Heido number 32, Okasen, he murmured softly as all 6 collapsed to the ground. With the necessary symbols and the incantation for the Kido already inscribed on the inside of the fan, just the application of sufficient Ryatsu would activate it. Rarely any of the top-level Shinigami used Kido in a serious fight, since the casting sequences for the common Kido were easily identifiable, making even the highest-level Kido insultingly easy to dodge or deflect if one was fast enough. Unless, of course, there was no casting sequence in the first place. The ability to inscribe pre-activated Kido on objects beforehand was a closely guarded Nakatomi family secret, and one such object, even one with such a low-level Kido, would easily cost several prime location mansions nowadays. Although, technically speaking, it was no longer a Nakatomi-only technique. To be fair to them, the fan had probably been well protected with layers upon layers of redundant mechanisms and a self-destruct function designed to obliterate the entire fan if anyone had ever come close to discovering the secret behind the technique. However, frankly speaking, there was likely nothing that could guard it forever against the man who had managed to recreate both the White Bone Pond and BLD Hell Pond after seeing them once. Not that anyone was going to tell the Nakatomi that. The whistle of an arrow sliced through the air. Suzuki raised his index finger and pointed, casting the only Kido he could manage without an incantation. A jet of red energy shot through the night, narrowly missing the trunk of one of the sakura trees. And then there was suddenly a body falling, bough clattering to the ground beside him, both having appeared out of nowhere. He only knew one person who favored invisibility Kido, especially one that could conceal Ryatsu. It was probably a good thing that he had chosen to pull out Kisuke's childhood fan, obtained legally, the blonde had promised, instead of one of his Shirkai's special abilities. Or chopped off the lower half of his formal kimono so that he could move, but he had the suspicion that the cost of repairing that would have come out of his already pitiful salary. It was a really good thing that he didn't have to pay for his own meals except for the rare occasions he chose to eat out. With another flick of his wrist, the fan snapped shut, and was stowed back in his sash. Now that the element of surprise was lost, it would be more of a hindrance than an advantage. Another rustle of grass had him tensing, but Kaien's Ryatsu washed over him and a moment later the man stepped cautiously out from the shadows, Ganju held firmly with one arm. Apologies for not assisting. Suzuki shook his head briskly. None was necessary. Seeing the clan head continue to frown guiltily, he added vaguely, gesturing to the ground. I have yet to use my Zanpakuto. There. Let Aizen wonder what that implied, if the megalomaniac was indeed around. He would have to inform either Kisuke or Yoruchi as soon as possible, but it was nigh on impossible for him to sense the blonde's Ryatsu in this chaotic mess, and he would be headed back to Yoruchi's position in a few moments anyway. Kaien's face cleared as he took in the wires, one still in the disc-shaped raft that had brought them to the riverbank, the other, spitting blue-white sparks, reforming into the dome. His eyes traveled to the fan tucked into Suzuki's obi, and he gave a wistful sigh. The Shihoin really spare no expense when it comes to equipment. It was a gift, demurred Suzuki as politeness would dictate. From a friend. Kaien blinked, but before he could respond another shower of fireworks scattered across the field, far too close to their position, and he automatically tugged Ganju closer to him protectively. Suzuki ducked back into the dome, resettling on the raft. After making sure that Kaien had settled Ganju securely between them, he lifted them off the ground. The addition of a third person, despite his size, made an unmistakable difference. Suzuki gritted his teeth and raised his Ryatsu output further, fighting to hold. There. Combined weight clear of the grass. Definitely. Needed. More practice. The heat of the battle had died down somewhat, but the occasional ping of stray projectiles deflecting off the protective dome told him that this method of return was the right choice. It would have been nearly impossible to SCRT Ganju safely back across the middle of the battlefield, with all three of them in formal kimonos, and to skirt around ran the risk of running into an ambush in the dark. Now he just had to make sure he could get them. There. In one piece. With her keeping a level 80 Kido active, Yoruchi's Ryatsu was like a beacon on the field. Suzuki squeezed his eyes shut, relying entirely his Ryatsu sensing skills to guide them. The raft shuddered slightly underneath them, and he gritted his teeth, forcing it to remain afloat for that last few meters to the barriers behind which the civilians were gathered. You're clear. Hearing Yoruchi's voice, Suzuki let the entire dome dissolve, and waited for Kaien to herd Ganju clear of the raft before he deactivated his Shirkai altogether. He landed on the ground, still in the crouched position he had been earlier, his Zanpakuto materializing in its sealed form next to his hand. His head bowed, and he drew in deep lungfuls of air, fighting to keep his limbs from shaking. It took more effort than it rightfully should to reach out for his sister's Ryatsu ribbon, glowing brightly not a few meters away, and send his message. Possible code 00 involvement. There was a slight pause, as though Yoruchi had forcibly swallowed her first response. Acknowledged. She didn't ask if he was all right, which he appreciated. She didn't need to, he would just have responded with some variation of "I'm fine anyway." To some extent, it was true, he was fine. Save for a few bruises and one cut along his arm from being thrown against the wire dome earlier, he was uninjured. His Ryatsu might have been a little lower than what would have been reasonably considered comfortable, but he was used to fighting under far more unfavorable conditions, against far worse odds. He just needed a few moments to catch his breath. His Zanpakuto was in his hand between the space of one breath and the next. Time, which he might not have. Suzuki launched himself backwards, using the hand that had been braced against the ground for added leverage to propel himself away, just as a sword moved out from beneath the ground where he had been crouched. His back collided painfully with the Danku barrier, and he winced as it forcibly knocked the breath out of his lungs, leaving him vulnerable for a moment. He clumsily brought up his Zanpakuto in his semi-sprawled position, using both hands to brace his sword against the first downward swing. Drawing one leg underneath him, he attempted to lever himself into a standing position, but stepped on the trailing hem of his kimono and very nearly overbalanced. Scrambling to keep himself in some semblance of a defensive position, he had to let go of his Zanpakuto, splaying both hands on the ground. His attacker grinned, teeth visible in the moonlight, and brought his own sword down for another slash. Suzuki's mind slipped blank, and the downward swing seemed to happen in slow motion as his eyes tracked the movement. His forearms tensed as he braced himself for the impact. Then he threw his entire weight onto his arms, flipping himself in a handstand as he simultaneously deflected the blade using his metal shin guards and kicked the attacker in the face. Both of them went sprawling, but he could hear the other man's sword clatter to the ground, which gave him the precious few seconds needed to get to his feet. Shield. Now. His Ryatsu surged outwards in response to Yoruchi's panicked cry, pouring out of him with no regard for elegance or finesse in his haste. He had a brief moment to think of very incredulous when a roar of fire blazed past, so close that he could feel the heat scorch his face, past the arms he had instinctively thrown up to protect his head. "I'm so sorry, Suzuki-san." Suzuki lowered his arms cautiously, taking in the blackened char that had formerly been his opponent. "Hideaki-san," he greeted cautiously, stripping off the ruined remnants of his gloves. Having taken the brunt of the Kido, they were little more than ashy strips now. Had he not raised his Ryatsu pressure in time to negate the bulk of the Shikaho, there would have been 2 smears on the ground. Hoshino Hideaki skidded to a halt in front of him, bowing repeatedly. "I'm so sorry, I was aiming at him." Indeed, his aim had been impeccable. Had Suzuki remained in his down position, the Kido would have gone completely over his head, and he would have suffered second-degree burns from the proximity at worst. A small price to pay, given that the original blow would have been fatal. "Do you understand, now, why the Academy insists that we communicate our intentions before we attack?" There was no point rebuking Hideaki further. He knew better than anyone else how close he had come to accidentally killing one of his allies. His ambush worked brilliantly in theory, and would have been perfect had he known for sure that Suzuki would not get up in time. However, when the extent of his ally's abilities were still relatively unknown to him, it had almost resulted in a costly error. Kisuke would have thrown a Rikujikoro at him, while either Yukimaru or Yoruchi would have bodily knocked his opponent out of the way. Even Isshin would have used Oni Dekapin or a similar Hakuda attack instead of his Zanpakuto. Certainly, none of them would have selected a wide-area indiscriminate attack, knowing that there was a chance that Suzuki could have been caught up in it. But there was no time for recriminations. Drawn no doubt by the opening of the barrier to allow Ganju through, the remaining enemy forces had gathered like moths to a flame. 10 seconds, he murmured out of the corner of his mouth. Hideaki gave a resolute nod, retreating to the edge of the Danku barriers. He clasped his hands together, head bowed as if in prayer. Suzuki picked up his Zanpakuto from the ground and strode forwards calmly, sword held ready at his side. His left hand dropped casually to his side. The enemy surged. 9. A gust of wind blew across the field, blowing the fallen sakura petals wildly about. 2 of the attackers fell, screaming, clutching bleeding stumps where there had been limbs. Many of them whipped their heads about, trying in vain to find the invisible enemy hiding amongst them. Then one of them, closest to the 2 young men, turned and charged at the 2 of them in rage, weapon raised. His sword sliced through Suzuki, and the afterimage dissipated, as insubstantial as the wind. In the middle of the crowd, Suzuki landed in a swirl of pink petals. "Way of Onmitsu, 3rd of the Shiho, Utsusimi," he whispered. His right hand slid his Zanpakuto into his obi, while his left hand snapped the fan open with a flick of his wrist. As they began to realize he was there, they screamed and charged, but they were too late. 5. The fan swept across his front, flipped casually into the air, and landed neatly in his right hand to complete a full circle, the back of the fan facing outwards the entire time. Yellow energy blasted outwards in a ring, with him as the epicenter, knocking them back several paces. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Hideaki's head come up. Spitting and snarling with fury, the enemy rushed toward Suzuki, converging on his position. 3. Unnoticed by the frenzied crowd, which was focused entirely on Suzuki, Hideaki raised his arms, both palms outstretched. 2. Channeling as much Ryatsu as he could handle to both legs, Suzuki jumped. 1. Twisted in mid-air, he could see Hideaki's lips moving, and though he couldn't hear anything over the wind rushing past his ears, he knew what the other was saying. 0. Kaha. Red fire streamed from both of Hideaki's palms, washing over the gathered crowd in a tidal wave. They tried to scatter, tried to turn and run, but save for the ones on the very fringe it was too late. Hideaki had opted for area of coverage instead of destructive power this time, so most of them would live, but a quick scan of the area showed that none of them would be in any shape to continue fighting. Sui Feng. Yoruchi's shout cut across the deafening silence. Suzuki's head jerked up, and he burst into a run as soon as he had pinpointed the girl's location, dropping into a tuck and roll just as a burst of fireworks exploded near his shoulder, shredding his tympanic membrane. He went down on one knee to maintain his balance, healed the damage to his inner ear with a single thought and snatched Sui Feng up. A flicker of forest green Ryatsu behind him let him know that he was not alone. Suzuki curled himself around the unconscious Sui Feng, absently running a basic diagnostic Kaido over her as Katsuo leapt over their heads, silver daggers flashing. Nothing in her status caught his attention, and he refocused outwards, senses alert for more incoming danger. There was a sudden outpouring of Ryatsu, and the shimmering Danku barriers vanished. In their places rose a single crystalline structure, comprising panels layered upon panels of individual hexagonal barriers that could withstand the assault of an army. The Nakatomi had finished. Everyone take cover in 20 seconds. Kaien's voice sounded in his mind, with the hollow echoing quality that indicated the usage of Tentikura. Scrambling to his feet, Suzuki's eyes widened as he stumbled, and he looked down incomprehensibly to see BLD pooling on the ground, the edge of a deep gash just visible below the hem of his kimono. When had he been injured? Was it while he was luring the enemy together for Hideaki, during the burst of fireworks that, or some time in between? It didn't matter. He only had 3 choices, the Nakatomi barrier, the Sakura trees, or the river bank. 12 seconds. Definitely not enough time for him to heal himself enough to get Sui Feng to the Nakatomi's barrier. Already, the structure was sealing itself up, the nearest Shinigami having escaped inside, followed closely by several enemies. It would be suicidal to go that way. Cramming his Ryatsu into his leg in a makeshift splint to keep himself from bleeding out, Suzuki hauled Sui Feng up unceremoniously. Broken bones grated against each other as his injured, more like fractured, he thought briefly, legs shook and threatened to give out, and his teeth bit through his lip with the effort of not making a single sound. Injured and carrying someone unconscious, he would be an easy target for any more enemies left in the vicinity. Pouring the rest of his available Ryatsu into his good leg, Suzuki made a split-second decision and took off for the tree line in the distance. They wouldn't fire the cannon directly at the Sakura trees, he hoped, though it was strong to tell with the crazy Shiba, but the riverbank was fair game, especially since the enemy had originally come that way. 4 seconds left. He could see the shadows of the outermost branches on the grass before him, the thick tree trunks beyond just barely visible in the dark. Then Sui Feng went tumbling from his arms, crashing into one of the trees, and it took him a heartbeat to realize that he was falling. His palms hit the ground with a sharp sting, and he choked back another cry of pain when the bones in his fractured leg twisted, but muscle memory had ensured that he had fallen without injuring himself further. He laid there for a breath, muscles spasming, before logic reasserted itself with the urgency of the situation, and he curled himself into a ball. He wasn't going to make it to cover in time. But he should be far enough from the center that if he was lucky, it wouldn't be instantly fatal and he would have time to heal the damage. Heido number 88, Hiryu Gekizoku Shinten Reiho. A tower of electrical and spiritual energy that even he could feel exploded from the Keikaku Ho, following Kakaku's triumphant shriek. Suzuki winced, so maybe his propensity for this monstrosity was inherited after all, though it made him shudder to think he had anything in common with his crazy aunt, and closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable pain. Bakudo number 81, Danku. Eyes snapping wide open at the familiar voice, Suzuki cautiously uncurled himself. Urahara Kisuke stared down at him, silhouetted against the sparks flying from the repelled Kido less than an inch away from them. "What would you do without me?" he asked rhetorically. "Got them." Yoruchi breathed out quietly, allowing her shoulders to sag slightly. "How are they?" "Suifeng-san is unconscious, but otherwise seems stable." "Suzuki." Kisuke's voice faded out for a moment before coming back. "Probably best if you send for a palanquin." She wouldn't let her heart skip. She wouldn't. Kisuke didn't ask her to send for Unohana, but she didn't like the hesitation in his tone, especially when coupled with Suzuki's last message that Aizen might be involved. "Also, I'd like to apply for a few days' leave. I have some suspicions about this poison." No, she didn't like it at all. "Consider it done." Kisuke yanked the kimono away from Suzuki's leg, lips thinning as he saw the bloody mess and the white of bone. "You can't feel it?" Leaning back against a tree trunk, Suzuki too was staring at his own leg, brown eyes slightly glassy. "I didn't even know I was injured." It came out as half a question instead of a statement, and he looked confused at his own proclamation. His hand glowed green as he ran it slowly along his calf, and there was the sound of bones grinding together as they shifted back into their original alignment. The former shopkeeper's frown deepened. Adrenaline alone should not be able to account for this phenomenon. He eyed the leg closer. Yes, that was definitely one of the main arteries in the leg. Any higher, and it would have hit the popliteal artery, which was likely the original target of the attack. A strike directly upwards from the ground, then. Compartmentalizing that thought for later consideration, he returned to the mystery at hand. It was highly unlikely that Suzuki had managed to completely miss such a deep gash due by accident. Even if his adrenaline rush had dulled the pain, it wouldn't have removed it completely. The statistical likelihood of the attack managing to sever all nerves in the area was too low to be a feasible hypothesis. This left. "Did you check for poison?" Suzuki stilled. His eyes fell shut and then opened again in a slow blink, and Kisuke was beginning to grow alarmed by the way his eyes couldn't seem to focus, the way his breathing was far faster than it rightfully should be. "Raise your body temperature, you're going into shock," he hissed. "I did." Suzuki protested, looking insulted. Unconvinced, Kisuke laid a hand over the pulse in his throat, checking his heart rate and core temperature at the same time. "You're freezing cold," he disagreed. "A nerve agent coupled with a numbing agent, perhaps. That would explain the overall disorientation and lack of sensation. Definitely not a typical poison you could buy on the black market. Yoruchi-san, I think we're going to need that palanquin sooner than later. And Tessai-san too." Isshin's eyes flitted to the Shihoin palanquin as it appeared in view, unremarkable in its presence amidst all the other palanquins, except for the fact that he knew the Shihoin princess. He was quite sure that Yoruchi had been uninjured, given that she had been right beside him for most of the battle, helping to keep the Danku barriers raised. Unlike some of the other nobles in attendance, she wouldn't summon her own palanquin without a very good reason. "Urahara-san, can I speak to you for a moment?" Walking next to the palanquin in full view, another oddity, he had never known Urahara Kisuke to openly flaunt his presence in such a manner. The former shopkeeper turned his head at the sound of Isshin's quiet voice. The blonde gave him a slight nod, casting his gaze back to the guard retinue surrounding them. Shihoin Katsuo slipped out from amongst the guards, Zanpakuto on full display as he took over Kisuke's position. On behalf of my clan, I wish to extend our gratitude to Shihoin Suzuki Dano for his invaluable aid in retrieving my errant nephew. His mouth was running on autopilot, even as alarm bells rang inside his head. Even though Kisuke was standing right in front of him, he could just barely sense the other man, and it was more like the faint impression of an echo than the ryatsu of a living person. What was Kisuke doing in high alert mode when the battle was, as far as he could see, over? The blonde eyed him contemplatively, and then he must have loosened the control on his ryatsu a fraction, for he could sense a tendril of crimson mist uncurling, just enough for him to grasp it gratefully. No gratitude is necessary, Kisuke replied formally. Suzuki will be fine, physically, just a broken leg. Tesai-san is tending to him now. Isshin bowed properly at 45 degrees, far lower than a captain should to a third seat, to convey the depth of his appreciation, even as he breathed an inward sigh of relief. The next sentence, however, had him tensing subtly. We suspect Aizen's involvement. He scrambled for a way to continue the conversation, to deflect the suspicion of two strangers, as far as everyone else knew, standing together in silence. How is Shiba-kun? Asked Kisuke abruptly. Then, as Isshin blinked dumbly at him, he added, Suzuki will no doubt wish to know. The poison coating the attacker's blades appears to be custom-made. I'll have to run some tests to be sure. Isshin's eyebrows shot up at the lack of an honorific appended to Suzuki's name, in public, no less. Ganju-chan will be fine, he replied. Kaien and Kakaku are chewing him out thoroughly at the moment for sneaking off to play at the riverbank without telling anyone. If Byakuya-kun hadn't noticed him wandering off and followed him, then purposefully drawn the enemy's attention. He trailed off. It was not strong to envision the end result of the spirit equivalent of a 6-year-old against them. Byakuya, who was nearly a century old, at least knew to keep quiet and keep his struggling to a minimum. Let me know how your investigation goes. I don't remember this event ever having occurred. Kisuke inclined his head in slight agreement with both of Isshin's assessments. I'll keep you posted. He must have drifted to sleep after a while, lulled by the swaying of the palanquin and the healing process, for the next time he opened his eyes he was in his own room back at the manor. We've been complacent. He had never heard Kisuke's voice in that particular tone before. Suzuki pushed himself up slowly, carefully. Were they talking about Aizen? Isshin mentioned, and I agree, that this didn't happen the last time around. An icy feeling ran down Suzuki's back, and he lurched the last few paces back into full consciousness, the words falling out of his mouth before he could stop it. So it's because of me then? If you want to think of it that way, Kisuke replied bluntly, without looking at him. He wasn't going to examine the roiling mix of guilt and horror rising in his gut. I'm the only thing that changed, Suzuki argued. He saw Kisuke begin to turn in his direction, a frown beginning to mar his brow, and the blonde had just opened his mouth to speak when he was interrupted. Yoruchi turned from the window, her features grim, a hell butterfly fluttering from her finger. I've just gotten confirmation of their identities. It is them, she added ominously. Then they're several decades early. All of Kisuke's attention was back on her, Suzuki seemingly forgotten for the moment. Another hell butterfly flitted through the open window. The captives are talking about a mysterious benefactor. Even in the dim moonlight, Yoruchi's face was noticeable paler. Kisuke growled, his ryatsu flashing visibly for a moment, painting the walls BLD red. Aizen. Already Yoruchi was shaking her head. We can't prove it. The blonde turned to her, and very deliberately raised an eyebrow. We. Yoruchi looked sharply at him, rising on her tiptoes to put her closer to Kisuke's eye level. You will stay out of this. We can't afford to draw any more of Aizen's attention if you want Suzuki to have a chance at successfully infiltrating Aizen's inner circle. She held out a hand for the next hell butterfly, pinning her head to a voice only she could hear. Check South Rukongai District 42, she instructed. There's a row of abandoned warehouses on the western edge, near the cliffs. Suzuki watched the latest Hell butterfly depart, momentarily distracted from his own thoughts. Wouldn't they question how you knew about their base of operations? No one will ask how the head of intelligence and covert operations comes by her information, Yoruchi answered drily. She turned back to Kisuke. I've gotten a sample of the poison delivered. With a single sharp nod, the blonde was gone from the room. It was lunch 2 days later when Kisuke reappeared, ignoring the others scattered about the room and making a beeline for Yoruchi. Sitting opposite her, Suzuki sat up straighter, dropping all pretense of eating his food. Artificial anticoagulant, he spat, holding up a vial of colorless liquid. Mixed with a slow-acting nerve agent, a local anesthetic, and mild paralytic specially designed not to interact with any of the other chemicals. The combination ensures people won't even notice they were hit and slows their reaction speed, but not sufficiently to normally warrant an in-depth post-mortem investigation. Yoruchi nodded, dropping her chopsticks carelessly on the table and rising from her seat. On its own, is it lethal? No, the blonde sighed, giving the vial a shake. If you hadn't noticed the wet sheen on their weapons, we likely wouldn't even have realized that they were using poison. Her gaze cut to Katsuo, seated several places away from Suzuki, and like the rest of the room had long ceased any pretense of interest in his food. In your professional opinion, what is the likelihood that such a mixture was found on the black market? Absolutely impossible, the commander of the executive militia replied immediately, without even pausing to consider it. Yoruchi simply nodded again, likely having expected as much. Then we can conclude that it came from their unknown benefactor. Are you aware of any individuals capable of creating such a concoction? Katsuo didn't respond verbally, but his gaze slid sideways subtly and he arched an eyebrow almost incredulously, as though wondering why she was even asking him that question. Kisuke raised an eyebrow right back. Yoruchi rolled her eyes. Anyone else, she stressed, arms folded. There was a significantly longer pause as Katsuo gave the matter his full consideration. Hikifun Kiryo Taicho, Unohana Retsu Taicho, Yamada Sinasukfuku Taicho, Eikon Fumisho Juroku Seiki, Nakatomi Junkodano, Hoshino Hisoka-san, Shiba Kakakadano, and known criminal at large Kuratsuchi Mayuri, he finally stated. Yoruchi stilled, expression turning completely serious. Kisuke, I want a comprehensive list of all the components, and a list of possible suppliers for the more exotic. Suifeng, inform Omitafuku Taicho that I want to see her in my office after lunch. Suifeng bounced to her feet, not a single hesitation in her step. Suzuki was glad to see that she seemed to have completely recovered from being knocked unconscious during the melee 2 days ago, and then accidentally thrown into a tree, not that anyone had told her the last part. The blonde spun on his heel and followed the two of them out, but not before leaving a parting message. I'll talk to you tonight. Suzuki watched the doorway through which they had exited, trying to organize his thoughts in order. Kisuke likely wanted to know why he had put out an alert for Aizen. What had seemed so obvious during the battle itself, he couldn't see that Bowman, couldn't even sense him, even though he had to be standing right there according to the trajectory of the arrow, and it had reminded him starkly of Aizen's invisibility Kido that had erased even Ryatsu's signatures, was no longer as apparent now. What if he had been mistaken? He had gotten poisoned some time during the battle, what if it had been messing with his senses even then? He suddenly realized that someone had been speaking to him. My apologies, could you repeat that please? Katsuo frowned at him, but obliged. At the start of the battle, when that Kuchiki brat was kidnapped, how did you know Urahara-san was there? Suzuki blinked at the former clan heir. Where else would he be? Huh, muttered Katsuo thoughtfully, turning back to his food. Suzuki stared at his side profile. What did that even mean? Ugh, why did everyone have to be so cryptic? It was so late that it could be considered early when the blonde finally turned up in his room. Suzuki jolted awake when the proximity alert ward triggered, hands scrabbling for his Zanpakuto, before realizing belatedly that the intruder wards were still silent. Sending out a quick pulse of Ryatsu to silence the proximity ward, he sat up, shivering slightly as a cold breeze came through the open window. Kisuke was leaning against the wall, eyes shadowed behind his open fan. The cool sensation of a privacy ward flowed over his skin, better to be safe than sorry, even in the middle of the manor, before the former shopkeeper spoke. "Tell me what you sensed." Haltingly, Suzuki narrated his suspicions, voice growing smaller and smaller as Kisuke didn't say a word, neither to disparage him nor to encourage him. The fan snapped shut when Suzuki finally trailed off, unable to continue any further. This, insofar as we could gather, was the situation. Shiba Ganju, as young children are wont to do, had become bored of the flower gazing, and had sneaked off alone to explore. Kuchiki Byakuya, noticing him leave, followed behind and was able to catch up at the riverbank. They were thus the first to spot the enemy's approach via the river, using hollowed reeds as breathing tubes. Knowing that they couldn't escape before they were seen, Kuchiki-san hid Shiba-kun amongst the reeds, and drew the enemy's attention to himself. He was captured and brought with the intention of being exchanged for his father for better leverage. Suzuki nodded, absorbing the new information. There was no need to repeat what had come next. Their first mistake was not checking that the sword you had dropped was in fact your Zanpakuto. No, interjected Suzuki quietly. Their first mistake was not making sure they had everyone accounted for. He could have sworn a quicksilver of a smile tugged at Kisuke's lips. To be fair to them, acknowledged the blonde, it would be difficult to confirm visual contact on 84 individuals. It was an exact replica of my Zanpakuto, countered Suzuki, though Kisuke had already known that. After all, he had been the one who had gotten it custom forged as a birthday gift for Suzuki. They were hardly going to ask me to release Shirkai as proof. Wasn't that the exact reason why it was the perfect decoy? The blonde conceded the point with a slight incline of his head. When you had not appeared with the other Shinigami fleeing towards the Nakatomi's barrier, Yoruchi contacted me. I spent some time tracking echoes of your Ryatsu all across the field before finding you at the edge of the sakura trees. Suzuki winced slightly at the reminder. He didn't remember much of the immediate aftermath of the battle, just vague impression, Kisuke calling his name, being helped into a palanquin together with Suifeng, Tessai's cool green Ryatsu. Was there any PRD of time when you had been distracted, for instance by a severe injury? He thought strong, frowning as he tried to dredge up distinct events in the blur of the battle. Yes, he replied in surprise. On my way to find Suifeng, a burst of fireworks too close destroyed my entire right ear, including the semicircular canals of the inner ear. The disorientation from the damage to my vestibulocochlear system prevented me from focusing on anything else until it healed. You were likely poisoned during that time, concluded Kisuke. The strike had been aimed upwards, from the ground, and given your habit of monitoring your own status it was unlikely that you managed to miss the initial injury to your own person otherwise. He had to ask. Do you think it was Aizen? Kisuke closed his eyes and tilted his head backwards, fan tapping at his upper lip. It was a long moment before he answered, words careful. That is the most likely explanation. However, we cannot discount the slim possibility that it had been another individual, especially given that Kuratsuchi-san at present would have both the capability and the resources to perform such a feat right now. Yoruchi is tracking down possible suppliers for independent confirmation. Suzuki watched him carefully. You don't think she'll find anything? The blonde snorted, a shadow flitting across his face. If it were Aizen-san, there will be nothing to find. A snatch of conversation, half remembered from that first night, surfaced. Did you already know who the perpetuators were? The tapping of the fan stopped. When we said this did not happen the last time, it wasn't fully accurate, Kisuke finally explained. There was an attack by these very same perpetuators, except that this time around, it happened 35 years too early. He did a quick calculation in his head. 35 years. After your exile, he spoke aloud thoughtlessly, and immediately wanted to hit himself for his tactlessness. Kisuk barely blinked, but he had known him for too long to be fooled by the lack of an outward reaction, especially in a trained assassin. Soul Society's betrayal had left a deep scar on the exiled Shinigami, and even Yoruchi, who had left of her own free will and had never been officially branded, rarely did more than allude to it. Indeed, the other man murmured tonelessly, before he could figure out how to even begin apologizing. And therefore my information is secondhand. From what Yoruchi managed to gather, they had attacked during a cherry blossom viewing, much like this one. No one had checked for the presence of poison, so we cannot be absolutely certain that it had not been present. The most significant difference, however, and he straightened, giving Suzuki his fullest attention, is that previously, Byakuya's parents did not survive. It took Suzuki several moments to remember how to form words again. They had barely been back 7 years, and already there were drastic changes in their future. How were they going to survive the century? I am starting to suspect our presence has already made greater waves than we have ever thought possible, Kisuk informed him somberly. Our foreknowledge will soon be rendered completely useless. He breathed out quietly. You need information, he repeated, partly as a reminder to himself, partly to confirm what Kisuk was implying. Can you do it? It wouldn't be easy, he knew. The mere thought of Aizen, the memories of watching his friends and acquaintances die one by one, directly or indirectly to him, made a pit of rage bubbling in his gut. He clamped down on his Ryatsu forcefully, fighting to mask his turbulent emotions. Could he play his part well enough to fool the MSTR of deception himself? By all means, it should have been impossible. Sending Kurosaki Ichigo on an infiltration mission? He would have blown his cover at the first sight of depravity Aizen displayed. Unlike Ikamaru Jin, he had always had a very strong moral code, and an inability to control his own emotions. But he wasn't that naive child anymore. He was stronger, used his brain more, and perhaps most importantly he understood there were greater things at stake. Running his mouth and swngng around a gigantic sword wouldn't save everyone, he'd seen that once already. However, he didn't have to turn into Ikamaru, didn't have to turn a blind eye to Aizen's machinations in an effort to gain his trust, didn't have to try to do everything alone. As Yoruchi had mentioned once, he, too, had a tactical genius on his side. One who's cryptic and melodramatic, though he hadn't seen that side of Kisuk for a while, not since the Vizart's deaths, and often preferred to let him fumble in the dark, true, but on his side. If Urahara Kisuk could train a human boy to fight on par with Zaraki Kenpachi, albeit using the man's hubris against him, in 3 days, he could figure out a way to defeat Aizen. All Suzuki had to do was provide him with the means to do so. The word impossible had never been in his vocabulary, and it wouldn't start now. He met gray eyes calmly. Yes. Studying the blonde closely, he suddenly became aware of the faint bags under his eyes, the prominence of his stubble, and how his slouch against the wall seemed less deliberate and more out of actual fatigue. Normally Kisuk took great pains to keep up his mask of being a lazy carefree idiot, and that included looking the part. Have you slept at all since that night? Or, he remembered lunch that day, how Kisuk had walked out minutes after he entered without even looking at the food, eaten anything. We need to track the leads before they go cold. That was a no, then. From what the other man was implying, he wasn't the only one, so, Yoruchi too, then. Perhaps even Katsuo. And what had he been doing the past 2 days? Kisuk must have caught the change in his expression, for he was interrupted before his thoughts could go very far. You were healing from a major injury, and this is not your area of expertise. I should still have done something, he insisted. After all, it was his fault, asked the blonde, and for a moment he wondered if Kisuk could actually read his mind. As if to prove his point, Kisuk rolled his eyes. It's written all over your face. Yes, it is likely that our presence is what caused this event to deviate from the one we know of, but it is hardly your fault. With this strike, Aizen-san can achieve multiple objectives. First, he could evaluate your character, and see if he can recruit you to his cause. Second, he could evaluate the capabilities of many of the top Shinigami in the Godai 13, learn their habits, perhaps even their Shirkai abilities. If he had been present at the battle, then you were right to keep your Shirkai special abilities hidden. And last, if any of them had died, especially any of the clan heirs or the Hashiji baby, it would only serve to sow discord amongst the noble clans and pave the way for his takeover. It didn't ease the guilt churning in his chst, not exactly, but for the first time in 2 days he didn't feel the oppressing helplessness at being unable to do anything pressing down on him. There is something you can do, Kisuke finally relented. The other 4 great noble clans are no doubt interested in our investigations. We need to send a representative around. He opened his mouth to object that diplomacy really wasn't his strong suit. Was Kisuke so tired that he didn't realize who he was asking? Also, Isshin wanted to know how you're doing. Kisuke eyed him, as though knowing exactly what he was thinking and replying yes, the blonde did know what he was doing. Thank you for the insult. You may also want to drop by the Hoshino family compound to reassure your friend and speak to his father, the captain of the Nakatomi's guard retinue. Well. That changed matters. He should have known Kisuke always had an ulterior motive or several. No one but Tessai and Isshin knows that you had been injured. Keep it that way. With that parting shot, the privacy ward lifted noiselessly and the blonde disappeared the way he had entered.